The cold wind moved through the broken forest where strange metal pieces lay. Around the crash site and the sky above was dark and cloudy, with no moon to show light and no stars to give hope, and the trees whispered like they were alive and hiding secrets. And in the middle of all this, a small alien girl with bright purple eyes and silver skin shivered as she sat alone behind the burnt engine of her broken ship, and her tiny hands hugged her knees as she tried to stay warm and stay hidden from whatever monster might be out there watching her from the shadows. She had heard the stories from her mother and the elders of her planet that humans were monsters, that they hunted aliens and used their bones for weapons and their skin for strange decorations and their voices for horrible songs. And she had never seen a human before, but she had seen the pictures and read the warnings, and she believed every word because those stories were all she had. And right now her ship was broken. Her communicator was dead, her food supply was gone, and her fear was growing with every sound in the woods. Then she heard it again, footsteps, heavy, slow, and steady, like something big was coming closer, and her heart jumped like a wild bird trapped in a cage, and she did not know if she should run or hide deeper or scream for help that would never come. And she just held her breath and waited and watched with wide eyes as the sound grew louder and closer. And then she saw him. The human was tall and strong and wore thick clothes that looked heavy and rough, and had something on his back that looked like a weapon, and something on his eyes that glowed faint green, and his face had hair and dirt and blood, and he walked like he had no fear of anything. And she was sure this was the end, that he had found her, and he would take her like the story said, and she almost cried. Then he did something strange, something that made no sense, something that confused her so deeply. She forgot her fear for a moment and just stared as he slowly reached into his bag and pulled out something soft and thick and brown, and spread it gently on the ground near where she was hiding. And then, without saying a word, without making any sudden move, he turned around and walked away into the dark trees again, leaving the soft thing behind. She waited for a trap. Maybe he would circle around. Maybe the blanket would explode. Maybe there were invisible wires. Maybe it was poison. But nothing happened. And the forest went quiet again, and only the wind moved the leaves, and the stars remained hidden behind the clouds, and the human did not return, and the blanket just sat there, still and harmless. After a long time she crawled forward, her silver fingers shaking as she touched the fabric, and it was warm and real and smelled strange, like fire and oil and metal and something she did not know. But it did not hurt her, and she wrapped it around herself, and it felt like safety, and she did not know why. She did not understand why the monster gave her something so kind, so gentle, so useful, and it scared her even more than if he had attacked. She spent the night in that blanket, listening to the forest and thinking of the stories and wondering if maybe the stories were wrong, or maybe this human was different, or maybe he was playing a long game to trick her into trusting him and then hurt her later. And the fear stayed, but something new had started, something small and strange, like a tiny light inside her chest that whispered, maybe not all humans are monsters. Maybe not. This one morning came slowly with cold blue light, and her ship was still broken, and she was still alone. And the human did not come back, and she was not sure if she wanted him to come or not. And she sat there with the blanket wrapped around her like a shield, and her thoughts spinning like a storm inside her mind. And for the first time since the crash, she did not cry, and that surprised her the most. Wind picked up again and blew leaves across the clearing, and the trees moved like they were watching her, and the blanket held her close, and the forest did not seem so big and scary anymore, and her eyes stayed on the path the human had taken, and her ears listened for those heavy footsteps again, because maybe, just maybe, she wanted to see him again, not to run, not to hide, not to fight, but to understand, because something was happening. Something that had never happened before in her life. Something The stories never told, something her people never imagined, something like hope. The sun climbed higher above the trees, and its pale light touched the broken metal of the crashed ship while the alien girl sat wrapped in the human's blanket, and her eyes stayed on the path he had taken the night before, and she did not know if he would return or if he had just come and gone like a strange dream. But deep inside her, something told her he would come back, and that thought both comforted and frightened her, because she still remembered the stories and the warnings, and her people never lied. But now those stories felt distant, like old echoes that could no longer guide her. She heard a sound again, slow and steady footsteps on dry leaves and soft mud, and her heart jumped in her chest, and she pulled the blanket tighter around herself like a shield, and her silver eyes stared through the cracks between the broken ship panels. And there he was, the human from the night before, the same heavy clothes, the same tall figure, the same glowing eyes, and this time he held something in his hands, a small metal container, and something wrapped in clothy moved with slow steps, his hands raised a little, his body bent forward, like he did not want to scare her, and he placed the items gently on a flat rock between them, and then he took a few steps back and sat down on the ground far enough to not be a threat and close enough to show he meant no harm. And the girl watched him and waited, and the human did not speak. He only looked at the forest, and then at the sky, and then at her, and smiled just a little, with a tired face that looked more sad than scary. After many minutes, she crawled forward, careful and silent, her movements like a frightened animal, and she touched the cloth bundle first, and inside she found a few fruits, soft and sweet smelling, and a strange piece of cooked meat that smelled like smoke and salt, and it made her mouth water, even though she did not trust it. And then she looked at the metal container and opened it slowly, and warm steam rose from it, carrying the scent of broth and herbs and something else she could not name. But her stomach growled, and she knew she was too hungry to wait. She took the food and returned to her hiding spot, still watching the human with sharp eyes, and she ate in small bites, ready to run if anything felt wrong. But the food did not hurt her. It warmed her from inside and gave her strength, and she looked at the human again, this time with less fear and more confusion, because he still had not tried to catch her or harm her or even speak, and he just sat there like a silent protector, waiting for nothing but her safety. The day passed slowly, and the human remained near the ship, sometimes fixing small parts, sometimes drawing lines in the dirt with a stick, and sometimes just resting with his eyes closed. And the girl watched everything. She studied his hands and his tools and his face, and she saw that he was tired and bruised, and one of his arms moved with pain, and still he came back with food, and still he gave her warmth, and still he made no demand. This sun began to fall behind the trees. She stood up from her place and took a small step forward, then another, and then she walked slowly toward the rock where he had left the food. And when she reached it, she placed one of her own fruits, a blue one with a bitter shell and a sweet core, in the same spot, and looked at him with a shy, uncertain glance before running back to her place and sitting again with a blanket pulled over her face. Human looked at the gift and picked it up and smiled a little wider and nodded and took a bite and did not spit it out. And she saw that he accepted it, and her heart felt strange, like a bird with open wings. And she did not understand what was happening between them, but she knew something had changed, and the fear was still there. But it was no longer the only thing inside her. That night the human made a small fire a little distance from the ship and placed a stone ring around it, and sat beside it and stared into the flames. And the girl stayed in her blanket and watched the fire flicker and dance, and she saw his face in the glow, soft and calm, and nothing like a monster. And when she finally closed her eyes to sleep, she did not dream of being hunted or hurt or alone, but of firelight and warm food, and the first smile she had seen from someone not of her kind. In the silence of the forest, broken only by wind and crackling flames, a silent friendship began to grow between two creatures from different stars. One giving warmth without asking, and one giving trust without words. And in that quiet place, something powerful was born, something her people never taught, something she never expected, something like peace. The forest was quiet again, and the night passed without fear, and the alien girl opened her eyes slowly as the early light touched her skin, and the fire was now cold and only gray ashes remained, and she looked around and saw the human still there, sitting near the same spot where the fire had burned, and he was awake and staring at the sky like he was thinking of something far away. And she did not hide this time, she just watched him and waited to see what he would do next. He did not move quickly or speak loudly or try to come close, and instead he took out a small object from his bag and placed it in front of him, and then he began to fix something, a metal piece from his gear, maybe, or a broken part of his tool, and she saw the way. His fingers worked strong, but careful and focused, and she felt curious and a little brave, and she stood up from her blanket and took one step forward, then another, and the human did not react. He just kept working like he was not afraid of her. At all, she came closer until she was near the rock where they always left things for each other, and she had brought another small gift today. A glowing leaf from her planet that gave off a soft blue light, and she placed it gently on the rock and backed away without running and waited to see what he would do. And when he looked up and saw the gift, his face changed, and he picked it up and looked at the glow and smiled. A real smile this time, and not just a tired one. He pointed at the leaf, then at her, and then gave a small nod, and she understood that he knew it was for him and that he liked it. And then he did something new. He picked up a stick and began to draw in the dirt, and she tilted her head and watched with interest as he made shapes not like letters, but pictures. One looked like a planet with rings, and another looked like a tree, and then he drew two figures standing together, one small and one tall, and he pointed at the small one, then at her, and at the tall one, then at himself. She came closer step by step and looked at the drawings. And then she took a small twig and carefully added to the picture a sun above the figures, and then a tiny dot between them, and they both looked at it and smiled, and the dot did not mean anything special, but somehow it made the picture feel more complete. And she sat down near him, not too close, but not too far, and they drew more pictures together. The hours passed, and they said nothing, but the silence was full of meaning. And they began to share things, not just food and gifts, but little habits and small gestures, like when she tapped her fingers twice before sitting and he started doing the same, or when he shook his head when something broke and she copied that too. And it became like a game without words, a way to understand each other without voices. Later, he took out a photo from his jacket, something small and worn, and he held it carefully, like it was very important, and showed it to her, and she leaned in to look and saw the faces of other humans smiling in the picture. Maybe his family, and she looked at him and pointed at the tallest one, and he nodded and touched his chest. And she understood that was him, and the others were people he loved and missed, and she felt a strange feeling in her chest, a kind of ache that was not her own, but came from seeing his eyes. Return. She picked up a stone and showed him the glowing mark on her wrist, the sign of her tribe, and pointed at the stars above, then at herself, and then at the broken ship. And he seemed to understand that she too had a home and people, and that now she was alone, just like him, and they both sat in silence. Again, not sad, but connected by the quiet pain they both carried. When the sun began to fall, the forest was still and calm, with soft sounds of rustling leaves and distant calls of night creatures, and the stars above were bright and clear, like tiny diamonds scattered across a black sky, and the fire near the wreckage burned gently, casting a warm orange glow on the human and the alien girl as they sat side by side, drawing in the dirt and sharing food and small smiles. And the night felt peaceful in a way that neither of them had known in a long time. She had started trusting him in her own quiet way, and he never pushed or asked too much. He just stayed close enough to protect her, but far enough to respect her space, and she liked that about him. She liked that he never looked at her like she was strange, or dangerous or weak, and she began to think that maybe humans were not monsters, maybe the stories were wrong, or maybe he was the one human who was different from all others. Suddenly a loud crack echoed through the trees like something heavy had stepped on dry wood, and both of them froze and looked into the dark trees where the sound had come from, and the girl felt her heart race, and she grabbed the human's sleeve without thinking, and he stood up at once, pulling out his knife and moving in front of her, his body tense and alert, and his eyes scanning the forest like a trained protector. Another sound came, a deep growl, low and full of hunger, and then glowing eyes appeared between the trees, large and yellow and filled with wild rage. And the creature stepped out of the shadows, tall and covered in dark fur with sharp claws and a mouth full of teeth, and it looked like something from the worst nightmares of both their worlds, a forest beast, not afraid of humans or aliens, and hungry enough to attack anything that moved. The girl stepped back, but the human did not move. He stood his ground with the knife in his hand and no fear in his eyes, and when the beast lunged, he pushed her aside and met the attack head on, and the two clashed in a blur of motion and sound, the human striking and dodging the beast, roaring and swiping with its claws, and the girl screamed, but her voice was lost in the chaos. A fight was brutal and quick. The human was strong, but the beast was faster and heavier, and it knocked him to the ground and slashed his arm and bit his shoulder, and he cried out in pain, but still he fought back, stabbing the beast in the side again and again until it roared in pain and ran back into the woods, leaving behind a trail of blood and broken branches and silence. Girl ran to him and found him on the ground, breathing hard and bleeding, and his face twisted in pain. And she did not know what to do, but she pulled his blanket from the shelter and tore a piece from it and wrapped it around his wound and pressed down to stop the bleeding, and he looked at her with tired eyes and tried to smile. Even as his blood soaked through the fabric, she dragged him closer to the fire, using all her strength, and covered him with the rest of the blanket and added more wood to the flames and sat beside him, holding his hand and whispering soft words in her language, hoping they would bring him peace even if he did not understand. And she stayed awake all night, watching over him like he had watched over her. The next morning came with soft golden light and birds singing, and the human was still breathing, though his skin was pale and his movements were weak, and the girl left for a short time to find water and herbs from the forest plants that she knew from her training back home, and she crushed the herbs and mixed them with water and placed the mixture on his wounds and prayed to the stars above that he would survive. She never left his side after that, not even for a moment, and when he opened his eyes again after 2 days and saw her there smiling with tears in her eyes, he reached out with his good arm and touched her face gently, and she leaned into his hand and closed her eyes and felt safe again. The bond between them had grown stronger than before. No longer just a silent friendship. Now something deeper, something forged in danger and pain and trust. And she knew now without doubt that he was not a monster. He was a protector. He was her protector, and the forest knew it too. For it stayed quiet after that, as if respecting the battle that had been fought, the lives that had been changed, and the friendship that had been sealed in blood and fire rain. And the cold came back. He stood up and walked a little away and returned with a bundle of dry branches and made a new fire, and they sat beside it, not touching but sharing the warmth, and for the first time she offered him a bite from her own food, a dried fruit with a bitter skin, and he took it without fear and ate it and nodded, and she smiled for the first time. That night they did not sleep far from each other, and the fire stayed burning, low and steady, and the wind did not feel so harsh, and the stars peeked through the clouds, and the forest felt less like a prison and more like a place where something new could grow, and as they sat there, drawing more pictures in the dirt and pointing at stars and sharing little things they did not know what to call this thing between them, but it was real, and it was strong, and it was the beginning of something that neither war nor fear nor distance could erase. And in the silence of the wild, two souls from different worlds became something more than strangers, something like friends, something like hope. The sun was soft and golden as it passed through the tall trees, and the wind carried the scent of leaves and fresh earth, and the alien girl sat beside the fire, watching the humans sleep, and his wounds were healing slowly, but the pain still showed on his face sometimes, and she made sure to keep the herbs fresh and the water clean, and she crushed the plants just like her mother had taught her before. She left home, and every time he opened his eyes, she smiled and whispered the names of stars to him in her language, and even though he did not understand, she felt like he listened. One morning he sat up for the first time and reached for his bag with a tired hand, and from inside he pulled out a small flat object covered in scratches and wrapped in cloth, and he held it like it was treasure and placed it gently between them, and she leaned closer and saw it was not metal or food, but a picture, and in it were faces smiling and bright and full of life, and she recognized him in the middle, but younger, with shorter hair and a clean face, and the people around him looked happy, and she knew they were his family. She pointed at the woman beside him, and then touched her own chest and looked at him with a question in her eyes, and he smiled and nodded and said one word softly, maybe her name, or just mother, and then he touched the picture again and looked at the sky, and his eyes became wet like there were storms hiding behind them, and she reached out and placed her hand over his, and they stayed like that for a while without speaking, and the silence was full of meaning. Then was her turn, and she picked up a stick and drew a shape in the dirt. A tall mountain is a glowing tree on top, and then a small round house beside a blue river, and she pointed at the tree, then at her mark on her wrist, and then at the sky, and he understood that this was her home, and that the glowing tree meant something sacred, and the river was the place where she had played as a child, and she looked at the picture and whispered the name of her planet, and he repeated it slowly, trying to say it right, and she laughed gently. They began to draw more every day, sharing stories and pictures and signs and sometimes little words they had picked up from each other, and the fire became their meeting place, and the dirt their paper, and their hands told tales of worlds so far apart, yet now held together by this quiet bond, and she drew the animals of her forest, and he showed her a tall building with windows like eyes and lights that never went out, and she asked if it was a sky tower, and he nodded and made flying signs with his hands. He taught her words in his language, simple ones like food, water, sun, and friend, and she taught him hers in return, and their voices slowly filled the air. Like music, and laughter came more easily, and smiles stayed longer, and even when clouds came, they felt safe because they had each other now, and even though the stars above belonged to different skies, they shared the same fire. One day he showed her something special, a small box with a light on top, and when he pressed it, it played a sound not like music, but like a voice, and she listened closely and heard the word father, and then a story began, a human voice telling something slow and warm, and she did not understand the words, but the tone made her heart ache, and he said it was his father's message from long ago, and she touched the box and said thank you in her language. And he nodded with a soft smile. She wanted to give something in return, so she took on the wind, carried the sound of something new, a sharp humming that was not from the forest, not from the birds, not from the human tools, and the alien girl stood up quickly, her eyes scanning the sky, her heart pounding like drums of warning, and the human looked at her confused until she pointed upward, and then he heard it to the soft growing hum that spoke of machines far above, and then they saw it together. A silver ship cutting through the clouds, slow and silent and shining like a memory from her old life. Her Hands trembled as she raised her wrist and tapped the communicator she had fixed days ago. Using spare parts from the wreck and signals from the forest crystals, and now it had worked. Now her people had found her. And they were coming, and she should have felt joy and relief and safety, but her stomach twisted and her eyes drifted to the human who was watching the ship with no fear, only quiet sadness, like he already knew what this meant. The ship landed at the edge of the clearing, tall and sleek, with blinking lights and polished metal, and the ramp opened with a hiss of air, and two figures stepped out, wearing white suits with her tribe's markings, and their faces lit up when they saw her. And they ran forward, calling her name, and she ran too, but stopped halfway and looked back and saw him still standing by the fire, holding the blanket they had shared. Her people reached her and wrapped her in a warm embrace, and checked her for wounds, and asked if she was hurt or sick or scared, and she nodded and smiled and said she was safe and alive. And then they looked past her and saw the human, and their smiles faded, and their hands moved toward their weapons, and she stepped in front of them quickly and raised her hands and shouted no. They paused, and she explained everything, how he had saved her from the beast, how he had shared food and fire and stories, how he had never hurt her or tried to control her, and how he had become her friend and protector. And when she finished, there was silence, and the forest seemed to hold its breath, and the human stood still, not moving, not speaking, just waiting. One of her people stepped forward slowly and spoke to the human in broken words, trying to understand who he was and why he had helped her. And the human answered with simple signs and a calm voice, and though the words were few, the meaning was clear. He had helped her because she was alone, and he knew what it felt like, and he had done it not for reward, but because it was right. They talked for a long time in circles and translations and cautious tones, and in the end, her people agreed to leave him unharmed, but made it clear that he was not to follow, that he must stay behind and never speak of this place, and never approach their kind again. And the girl felt her throat close, like she could not breathe, because she had known this moment would come, and still it hurt like a wound with no cure. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and nothing needed to be said, because their eyes carried every word and every memory and every promise. And she walked to him slowly, and he opened his arms, and she stepped into them, and they held each other for the last time. Not as strangers from different worlds, but as two souls who had found something rare and real in a broken forest. She pressed the carved stone into his hand, the one with the glowing leaf and the protection symbol, and closed his fingers around it, and whispered something soft in her language, and he nodded, though he did not understand. And then she turned away and walked toward the ship, her steps slow and heavy, like each one pulled a piece of her heart. The ramp closed with a quiet thud, and the engines began to hum, and the ship rose into the sky, leaving behind the forest and the fire, and the human who stood alone now, holding the last gift she had given him. And as he watched the ship disappear into the clouds, he did not cry, and he did not speak. He just stood with the blanket over his shoulders, and the wind in his hair, and the stars in his eyes. And far above, in the ship, she sat by the window and looked down at the world growing smaller, and her hands pressed against the glass, and her thoughts stayed with him, with the one who had shown her kindness without reason and warmth without words. And now she was safe. But she did not feel whole, because part of her had chosen to leave, and part of her had wanted to stand. In that choice, she had learned something no book or elder or story had taught her, that sometimes home is not a place or a people or a planet, but a fire shared in the dark, a drawing in the dirt, a hand reaching out with nothing to gain and everything to give of the glowing leaves from her ship, and pressed it into a small flat stone, and then carved a symbol in it, the sign of protection from her tribe, and gave it to him. And he held it close to his chest, and said her name for the first time, and though it was not perfect, it sounded beautiful, and her eyes filled with tears that she did not hide. Every night they watched the stars together and pointed at constellations. and made stories about them like two children under the sky, telling tales of heroes and monsters and forgotten lands. And each night, they added one more tale to their collection, and each night the silence between them grew warmer and deeper, and full of trust. And though the wreckage of her ship still lay in the clearing, and though the world around them was wild and unknown, they had created something real, something strong, something that no distance or language or fear could destroy. And as they sat beside each other and shared the stories of their stars, they were no longer just a human and an alien. They were friends. They were family. They were light in the dark. The days passed like slow winds across the trees, and the humans stayed in the clearing near the wreckage where the fire still burned each night, and where the dirt still held their drawings, even though rain had started to wash them away. And he sat there each evening holding the stone she had given him, the one with the glowing leaf and the carved sign, and he watched the sky, like he was waiting for something he could not name. And each morning he walked through the forest collecting fruit and wood and herbs, and each night he returned to the same spot beside the fire, where they had once shared silence and stories and smiles. He did not speak much now, and he kept the blanket close, even when the nights were warm, and he carved little shapes into the trees, small stars and curved lines that looked like her symbols, and he made a new shelter, not because he planned to stay forever, but because it gave him something to do, something to build, while his thoughts stayed full of her voice, her eyes, her laughter, and the way she used to touch his arm gently when she wanted to ask something without words. Far above, the stars continued to move, and her ship traveled across systems and planets until it reached the place she once called home, and her people welcomed her with songs and cheers and questions, but her eyes were distant and her answers short. And each night she would walk to the highest cliff and look at the sky and wonder if he was looking at the same stars, and if he was still sitting by the fire and still drawing in the dirt and still keeping the stone safe. She tried to return to her old life, to the rhythms of her world and the rules of her tribe, but everything felt too quiet, too clean, too sharp, and she missed the rough edge of his voice and the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, and the strange stories he told with pictures and gestures, and the way he always gave more than he took, and how he never asked for anything, except maybe her trust. One evening she heard voices outside her home, urgent and loud, and when she stepped out, she saw a crowd gathered around a new ship, one that had landed without warning, and from it came two of her people, injured and scared, and behind them was a message carved into a piece of metal. A human message, a call for help, simple and clear, and marked with the same symbol she had given him without waiting for orders or permission. She ran to the launch bay and found a pilot who owed her a favor, and they left in the quiet of night, flying fast through stars and storms and across the distance between her world and the forest that now held her heart. And when they arrived, the clearing was not the same. The wreck was gone, the shelter broken, the fire cold, and no sign of him in sight. She stepped out and called his name, not in her language, not in his. Just a sound filled with hope and fear, and something more, and from the edge of the trees he stepped out, thin and tired, and holding the blanket still wrapped around his shoulders and the stone still hanging from a cord around his neck, and he looked at her like she was the first light after a long winter, and she ran to him. Without hesitation, they did not speak for a long time. They just stood in the middle of the clearing, holding each other and letting the silence speak. And then she pulled back and looked at him and smiled, and he smiled too, and then he laughed. A deep sound full of joy and pain, and she laughed with him, and the forest felt alive again. She told him about the message, about the ones he had saved, and he nodded and pointed to the forest path where more injured beings waited, hidden and weak and scared, and she called for help, and her ship took them aboard. And her people looked at the human with new eyes now, not as a monster or a danger, but as a protector and a friend, and maybe even a hero. When it was time to leave again, she looked at him, and then at the ship, and then back at him, and this time she did not walk away alone. She reached out her hand, and he took it without question, and they stepped onto the ramp together, and the stars above welcomed them with soft light and silent music hand as they flew into the sky together, leaving behind the place where it all began. She looked at him and whispered something she had always wanted to say, something that had waited in her heart since the first time he gave her his blanket, and he smiled and nodded, and held her hand tighter on. Though the stars were still vast, and the world still many, they knew that no matter where they went, they would always carry with them the fire they had built, the trust they had earned, and the truth they had lived, that he was never a monster. He was her home.